I live alone. Every night there are men prowling around my ranch. I need someone to stay with me." Josie Lanier said those words through the iron bars of her gate, to a man she'd known for less than the time it takes a cup of coffee to go cold. The heat from the steel thermos lid still trembled in her hand, while her other hand rested gently on her belly where the child who would never meet its father gave a small kick, as if trying to hold its mother back. The gray-eyed man standing beside the dust-covered pickup didn't answer right away. He never answered right away. And Josie had no idea who she'd just said those words to, no idea that in a city 400 miles away, the hands now holding her coffee only had to pick up a phone to make hardened men bow their heads, that people whispered that 3 names had vanished from the books after a single call from him. All she knew was that this very morning, in the middle of town, she had spoken these same words before a row of men sitting on the diner porch, and they had laughed in the face of a pregnant widow, and not one of them stood up. Yet this man came on his own. No one called him. No one sent him. On the very day she lost 3 more horses while her fences stood untouched, her locks stayed whole, and her old dog slept soundly on the porch. And Josie suddenly remembered back when she was still in mourning for her husband. She had poured coffee for a stranger under that same oak tree. That pot of coffee had taken everything from her. Now here she stood again, inviting a man with no name to stay in her home. This man would uncover in a single afternoon what the whole county couldn't find in half a year. He would also tell her one lie that would break her heart, and one truth that would break it even more. But the story of that day had begun long before the sun ever rose. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories yet to come. Josie woke while the sky was still pitch black, not because of any sound, but because she had forgotten how to sleep a long time ago. Sleep had become like an old visitor to her now, stopping by for a few hours before leaving without saying goodbye. She lay still in the darkness for a while, listening to the familiar creaks of the wooden house as it breathed, listening to the wind slipping beneath the porch roof, and listening to her own heart beating hard in uneven waves for reasons she couldn't understand. The baby inside her shifted gently, as though it, too, had awakened with its mother. She placed a hand over her belly, whispered something that never quite became words, then sat up, slipped her feet into the worn leather boots she had left beside the bed, pulled on the heavy coat her husband had left behind, and carried a flashlight out through the door. The ranch yard was cold and silent. The old dog lay curled on the porch. At the sound of his owner's footsteps, he merely opened his eyes, thumped his tail twice against the wooden boards, then lowered his head onto his paws and went back to sleep, calm as though nothing had happened during the entire night that might have been worth barking at. That calmness was the first thing that tightened around Josie's chest. The dog had guarded the ranch for more than a dozen seasons, and had once torn the night apart with his barking over nothing more than a fox prowling beyond the fence. Yet this morning he slept as soundly as a well-fed child. She walked toward the row of stalls, sweeping the flashlight beam across each wooden doorway, and her feet stopped before her mind had time to understand what she was seeing. 3 stalls were empty. 3 silent pockets of darkness stared back at her. Josie counted, then counted again. Then she counted a 3rd time, walking slowly down the stable aisle now, laying her hand on each warm back that remained and softly calling every name, as though speaking the right names might bring the missing horses walking out of the darkness. None of them came. The 8 that remained stood perfectly still, their breath turning to smoke in the flashlight beam, their eyes wet and peaceful, and their peace was every bit as frightening as the old dog's calmness on the porch. She went to the main gate. The chain was still wound tightly around it, and the padlock remained firmly closed, icy against her palm. She raised the light toward the cheap camera mounted on the post, the one she had bought after the first horse disappeared, clinging to the innocent belief that a machine might guard what human beings had failed to protect. Later, sitting in her kitchen, she would play the recording back and see nothing but a wall of solid darkness. There wasn't a single human figure, not one glimmer of light, not even the movement of a branch. It was as though the darkness itself had opened the gate and led her horses away. Josie followed the fence line 1 step at a time, her hand brushing across strands of barbed wire wet with cold dew, moving from the rear corner of the yard, around the low pasture, and all the way to the edge of the woods, where her land met the shadows of dark, thorny oak trunks. Not one strand of wire had been cut. Not one fence post had been loosened. Not one tire track marked the damp earth beside the road. When something was stolen, there ought to be signs left behind by the thief, yet her land was so clean and undisturbed that it felt almost brazen, and it was that very perfection that raised gooseflesh along both of her arms. She returned to the open yard, where the wooden feed trough stood worn smooth by countless seasons. The flashlight beam fell into the trough, and Josie froze. It had been licked clean. This wasn't the ordinary cleanness left after horses finished their feed overnight, when a few damp crumbs would always remain stuck in the wooden corners. This was the cleanness left by tongues that had licked the wood again and again, slowly and thoroughly. The cleanness of a feast far more generous than the portion she had poured out the evening before. Someone had fed her horses, right there in the middle of her own yard. In the night, Josie placed her hand on the worn rim of the trough, on the hollow shaped by so many years of horses pressing their necks against the wood, and she spoke into the emptiness before her voice so low that even she could barely hear it. "You came in here. You came in here and fed my horses." It was the first time she had said it aloud, and it was also the first time that Josie Lanier felt afraid on this land that had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations, the only place left in the world that she could still call home. Beyond the distant line of hills, the sky began to brighten into a thin gray thread, and she knew she had to go down into town before she had time to change her mind. The town in Larkspur County had only one main street, with a small church at the top of the slope and Miss Pearl's diner at the bottom, while between them stood the brick building of the Cattlemen's Association, its door always left slightly ajar. A long row of wooden benches stretched across the diner porch, and every morning, without fail, the same men sat there, wearing the same hats, drinking the same coffee, and telling stories that never traveled beyond the county line. Josie parked her truck, stepped down, and felt every pair of eyes settle on her back before she had even placed one foot on the first step. She had rehearsed the words all the way into town, practicing until every sentence sat neatly inside her mouth. Yet when she stood in the middle of that porch before a row of men slouched on wooden benches, she still had to draw a deep breath before she could speak. "I live alone. Men have been prowling around my ranch every night. I need someone to stay with me. I'll pay with whatever I have." The diner fell silent for a beat. The radio behind the counter kept rambling to itself about livestock prices. One man turned the brim of his hat slowly between his hands, his eyes fixed on the floor. Another spat a wad of tobacco over the railing, taking his time, as though that alone were an answer. Josie called each man by name. "Mr. Tillman, your boys are grown now." The old farrier only shook his head and said, "My boy already has work over at Crown Ridge, Miss Josie. What about Mr. Mayfield?" The man named Hollis lowered his eyes to the brim of his hat and never looked up again, his broad hands gripping each other as though he were praying for something. No one had to explain, because everyone on that street knew which ranch offered the only wages in the county that were always paid on time. Then, from the farthest end of the bench, a man with a thin mustache, someone whose face she knew but whose name she had never learned, called out that finding a man willing to stay at the Lanier place would be easy enough. The hard part would be finding one who only wanted the ranch and didn't want that belly along with it. Laughter burst down the length of the bench. One man slapped his thigh, another laughed so hard he choked on his coffee. Behind the counter, Miss Pearl brought her dish towel down against the wood with a sharp crack and shouted that anyone who wanted to laugh like that could take it out into the middle of the street, because her porch wouldn't hold it. Josie stood there with both cheeks burning, one hand gripping the porch post, the other hanging at her side. She didn't cry. She looked down at the worn wooden boards for a few seconds, waiting for the tightness in her throat to pass, then raised her head, looked straight at that row of men, and said the words the town would repeat for years afterward. "I'm not looking for a husband. I'm looking for one night of sleep." The laughter died as though someone had clapped a hand over it, and at that exact moment, the door of the association building across the street opened. Harlan Voss came down the steps and crossed the dirt road at an unhurried pace, his stiffly starched white shirt bright beneath the morning sun, and the sound of his heels alone was enough to make every man on the benches sit straighter. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply let his eyes travel over the porch, slow and smooth, then said that no one in this county had the right to laugh at a woman carrying an entire livelihood on her shoulders, by herself. The man with the thin mustache turned red all the way to his ears and lowered his face toward his coffee cup as though he wished he could crawl inside it. Then Voss tipped his hat to Josie, his voice soft as freshly churned butter. "Miss Lanier, I heard about the horses." Josie answered that he had heard quickly. He smiled and said that news traveled fast in this county. It was only the truth that tended to take its time. Then, Still in the same breath, he held out both hands. The first hand, I'll send 2 of my men to your place. They can sleep in the barn and take turns watching through the night. No pay. Consider it neighborly kindness. The second hand, your family debt comes due at the fall auction, and you won't have enough horses to cover it, so I'll advance whatever you're short. All you have to do is sign a purchase option. Pay the full amount on time, and that paper becomes worthless. I'll tear it up right in front of you, but should you fail to pay, the land comes to me at a fair price. Josie looked down the street, looked at the row of men on the porch, then looked at her own reflection warped in the diner window. I'll accept the men, sir, but not the paper. Voss didn't so much as tighten a single muscle in his face. He put his hat back on and said the offer would remain on the table until auction day, then crossed the road again at the same easy pace, as though they had done nothing more than discuss the weather. Miss Pearl came around the counter, pressed a parcel of still-warm biscuits into Josie's hand, then leaned close to her ear and whispered that when a man offered a woman both guards and money in the same breath, she was allowed to choose only one. Never take both, child. Josie climbed back into her truck without fully understanding what the woman meant. She would understand later, and when she did, it would hurt terribly. The red dirt road back to the ranch ran between 2 old fences, and every time the truck rolled around the bend where the oak tree stood with its crown broken off, Josie saw Wade sitting in the passenger seat so clearly that she had to remind herself the seat was empty. Wade Lanier had been born on that land. His father had been born there too, and his grandfather had been the first man to drive a fence post into the grass of Cedar Hollow, back when the road beyond it didn't even have a name. Josie had come from somewhere else, the daughter of a mechanic across the state line, with no land, no relatives, and no dowry except for 2 hands that never seemed to tire. Wade married her and taught her everything. He taught her how to read the nature of each horse by the angle of its ears, how to hold the leg of an injured animal without frightening it, and even how to laugh again after a day of falling hard enough to leave her body covered in bruises. There were 2 things about Wade that she believed made up the whole of the man he was. The first was the blue enamel coffee pot, with a chip along one side, always kept warm in the corner of the kitchen, and the rule he observed with the devotion of a sacred vow, that no traveler should ever be denied a cup of hot coffee and a shaded place to sit, whether they were known or unknown, rich or poor, because he said kindness was the only thing in this world that became fuller the more of it you poured away. The second was his whistle, 2 short notes, then 1 long. That was all it took, and every horse in the herd, even those grazing at the farthest end of the lower pasture, would lift its head at once and come running home in a long line, manes flying in the wind and earth trembling beneath their hooves, as though that simple sound were an invisible cord tied to the heart of every animal. A horse raised by the whip remembers the whip, Wade used to say. A horse raised with love remembers the call. Since the day he was gone, Josie had pursed her lips every evening at feeding time and whistled that same pattern, 2 short notes and 1 long, not because the horses needed it, but because she did. As long as that sound still carried across the pasture, some part of Wade remained alive, still walking somewhere among the animals he had loved. Before the rainy season that year, Wade had taken the first great gamble of his life. He borrowed a sum from the agricultural bank, worth nearly everything they owned, using it to build a new row of stalls and bring home a breeding stallion with a bloodline as beautiful as poetry. Then he stood with 1 arm around his wife, looking at the structure that still smelled of freshly cut wood, and told her with absolute certainty that 1 season of foals would be enough to clear every debt they had. "Just trust me," he said. And she did. She trusted him until the night the rain came down like a waterfall, when his truck was found below the bridge at Miller's Creek, lying on its side among the rocks and rushing water, with no witnesses and no clear tire marks showing that he had tried to brake on the rain-slick bridge. People said it was the storm, the slippery road, fate. But the insurance company didn't speak of fate. They sent her a letter written with a politeness so cold it made her skin crawl, informing her that the provisional payment had been suspended because the investigation had not yet ruled out the possibility that the driver had caused the accident himself. And from those neat, unfeeling lines of print, the whispers began creeping through the town like the roots of weeds. People said the Laniers had been drowning in debt. They said Wade had gone first, so he wouldn't have to watch the land being taken. They said he had abandoned his wife and their unborn child. No one ever said those things directly to her face. They merely changed the way they looked at her when she entered the diner, or lowered their voices when she passed by, and that quiet murmuring weighed more heavily on Josie's chest than the enormous debt itself. Because she knew her husband, the man who pressed his ear against his wife's belly every night to hear the baby kick, the man who had already chosen a name for their child and left a little wooden horse half-carved in a drawer, would never have chosen to abandon the two of them. That was why Josie's fight had never been only about keeping the land. She was fighting for the day when she could stand in the middle of that town and tell everyone that Wade Lanier hadn't walked away, and that the child inside her would grow up with the memory of a decent father, not with a rumor. The truck climbed the final rise, and the ranch roof came into view beneath the midday sun. That was when Josie saw a strange dust-covered pickup parked outside her gate, with an ash-gray horse standing in the bed. The man stood leaning against the side of his truck, neither impatient nor checking the time, standing with the stillness of someone who had grown accustomed to waiting for everything life might bring. Josie slowed her truck, parked some distance from the gate, and remained behind the wheel for several breaths before stepping out. The horse in the truck bed was very old, its ash-gray coat flecked with silver around the eyes, its hip bones rising sharply beneath its skin, yet it stood steady and silent as a statue carved from mist. The man tipped the brim of his hat slightly when she approached and asked, in a deep voice that didn't belong to this part of the country, "Ma'am, if your kitchen is still warm, I'd be grateful for a swallow of something hot." Those were the exact words this land had taught her never to refuse. Josie went into the kitchen, lifted the chipped blue enamel pot from the corner of the stove, filled the steel lid with coffee, and carried it outside, passing it through the iron bars without opening the gate. The man received it with both hands and nodded his thanks, but he didn't drink. He set the steaming lid on top of the stone gatepost, then asked for a bucket of water from the pump. Josie brought one out, and she stood there watching the stranger perform a sequence of movements that seemed to stop the blood inside her body. He dipped one hand into the bucket and splashed water over the old horse's forehead until it was thoroughly wet, then stroked the length of its nose twice to ease the heat of the long road before tilting the bucket so the animal could drink. He waited slowly and patiently until the horse had swallowed the final mouthful. Only then did he turn back, pick up the steel lid, and take his first sip of coffee. The animal drank first, the man afterward. The forehead was cooled first, the throat afterward. Every movement, every step in its proper order, was exactly as though Wade Lanier had come back to life inside the body of a stranger. "Who taught you to do that?" she asked, and her voice turned rough before she could hide it. The man looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat and answered slowly, "An old man." "What old man?" He turned the steel lid between his hands. "An old man who isn't in this world anymore." Then those gray eyes left her and moved over the chain wrapped around the gate, down the straight fence line running toward the woods, and across the yard where the wooden trough rested beneath the sun. It was the gaze of a man who wasn't admiring the view, but reading it, studying every trace the way another man might read a page. "Your lock was replaced recently," he said. "There isn't a single repaired place in your fence. Your dog is well fed and comfortable around people." Josie asked what that meant. "It means that when a person loses horses without a broken fence, a forced lock, or a barking dog, that person hasn't been robbed, ma'am. Those horses were called away." The final two words fell into the stillness of noon, and Josie could hear the beating of her own heart. "Called away," she repeated. "Horses can't open gates," he said, "but horses have legs, and they follow what they trust. Someone has taught your horses to trust something other than you." Josie stood inside the gate of her own home, one hand gripping the iron bars, and in that moment everything came rushing back at once. The 3 empty stalls before dawn, the laughter bursting across the diner porch, the purchase option waiting on Mr. Voss's desk, the cold letter from the insurance company, and the child growing inside her with every passing day. She heard herself telling this stranger the same words she had struggled to force from her mouth in town that morning, that she lived alone, that someone had been prowling around the ranch every night, and that she needed a man to stay there with her. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He watched her for a long while, without curiosity and without pity, then asked only one question. "What can you pay?" "Whatever remains after the auction," she said, "if anything remains." He nodded as though that were the fairest price anyone in the world had ever offered, and said that 3 meals a day would be enough, and he didn't need a bed. "The barn will have men staying in it soon," she said. "The only place left is the tack room. It's cramped and smells of old leather." "I've slept in places far worse than that," he replied. She asked his name. "Gideon." "Gideon what?" "Gideon is enough to give orders to, ma'am." She opened the gate. The man led the gray horse down from the truck bed, and when she pointed toward the first empty stall in the row, the old animal walked inside on its own, turned in the proper direction, and stood perfectly still. It didn't sniff the air, paw at the ground, or make a single uncertain sound, as though it had merely returned home after a long journey. Josie watched it and couldn't understand why gooseflesh rose along her arms. Late that afternoon, a small truck from Crown Ridge pulled into the yard. 2 of Mr. Voss's ranch hands carried mattresses and bags into the barn. The older, silent man named Earl merely nodded in greeting, while the younger one, a fellow named Bryce, with the beginnings of a mustache, walked around the yard with his hands in his pockets, praising everything he saw. When he stopped beneath the old oak tree and remarked that it gave fine shade and must have been there since the days of her old man, a cold current ran down Josie's spine from the nape of her neck to the small of her back. She had heard that voice before, right beneath this very oak tree, over a cup of coffee. From that day on, Cedar Hollow Ranch gained a new sound, the steady, unbroken sound of a silent man at work. Gideon rose before Josie, and she had always believed there wasn't anyone in the world who woke earlier than she did. He pulled out every rotting fence post, buried new ones, tightened the wire, repaired the sagging stall door, cleared the drainage ditch behind the barn, and worked from the hour when dew still clung to the grass until the stars had risen, never once complaining, and never asking for anything more. He built a new feed trough from fresh, fragrant lumber still pale from the saw, but he refused to remove the old trough worn smooth in the middle of the yard. He left the 2 standing side by side, and when Josie asked why he didn't clear the old one away to make more room, he answered simply that the horses belonged to the old one. "Ma'am, when you raise an animal, you shouldn't force it to forget what it loves." She remained standing there for a while after he said it, longer than there was any reason to. A boy named Cody from across the creek waited over every day to help in exchange for 2 meals. A 19-year-old orphan whose shoulders still seemed loose and unfinished, but whose eyes were bright and who was willing to learn. Gideon didn't send him on meaningless errands the way other men might. He made the boy bend down close to the earth. One morning, while the yard was still damp with dew, Josie was kneading dough in the kitchen when she heard the man teaching the boy through the open window, his voice deep and slow. "Look here," he said. "This print sinks at the heel because the animal was standing at rest. This one sinks at the toe because it was moving forward with purpose. And when a track has been smeared into a streak, that isn't the wind, boy. The ground doesn't know how to lie. The liar is the person holding the broom that wipes the ground clean." Josie's hands stopped on the mound of dough. She stood motionless beside the kitchen window for a long time, unable to understand why a sentence about dirt had tightened her throat. Then came the afternoon when everyone at the ranch saw what those hands truly knew how to do. The young horse they had bought the season before had always been the wildest in the herd. And that day, while it was being led into the enclosure, a flapping sheet of canvas frightened it. It tore the lead rope free, reared onto its hind legs, threw Cody against the fence, then began circling the pen like a storm trapped behind wooden rails. Josie hadn't even had time to shout for the boy to crawl out when Gideon stepped over the barrier and entered the enclosure without a whip, without a rope, and without so much as a handful of grass to tempt the animal. He didn't walk directly toward it. He stood slightly to one side, turned one shoulder, lowered his chin, fixed his eyes on the ground, and began speaking in a voice so low that no one beyond the fence could make out a single word. They could hear only the rhythm, steady and warm like distant rain. The young horse ran 2 more circles. On the third, it slowed. Then it stopped. Its ears, which had been pinned flat, lifted and turned toward the man. Its nostrils flared, and it began walking toward him on its own, one step at a time, until its sweat-soaked forehead came to rest against his shoulder. A little while later, before anyone could understand how it had happened, Gideon was sitting on the back that had never allowed another person to mount it, guiding the horse in slow circles around the enclosure, in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to respect it. Josie stood behind the fence with her fingers gripping the wooden rail, and she realized she was trembling, not from fear, but because those hands, that tilt of the shoulder, that way of lowering his voice until it came from the deepest part of his chest, all belonged to the same school as the man with the blue enamel coffee pot. It was as though 2 men who had never met had learned from the same teacher beneath the same distant porch. From that day forward, it became a custom. Every morning before dawn, Josie placed a cup of hot coffee on the sill outside the tack room. Gideon never thanked her in words, But by evening, the cup had always been washed spotless and turned upside down in its proper place, and some things between human beings had no need to pass through speech. Mr. Voss stopped by once, bringing a sack of mineral salt and a new coil of rope as a neighborly gift. He stood in the yard offering praise for everything he saw, while his sloping-shouldered son Wesley remained behind the wheel from beginning to end, both hands resting on the steering wheel and his eyes fixed on the road ahead, never once lifting his head to greet the woman standing only a few steps away. Then, one late afternoon, while Gideon was bent over setting the final fence post into the ground, a polished black SUV with plates from another state came slowly to a stop outside the ranch gate. The man who stepped out wore a neatly pressed gray suit that looked out of place amid the dust of the road. He waited at the gate without sounding the horn and without calling out. Gideon lowered the shovel, wiped his hands on the muddy legs of his trousers, and walked over. Josie watched through the kitchen window. She couldn't hear anything. She only saw the man in the gray suit speaking at length, raising both hands several times, while her hired man stood as still as the post he had just buried, listening to everything before answering with one brief sentence. The finely dressed man stepped backward before a laborer whose trousers were still stained with mud, then climbed into his vehicle and drove away without looking back. That evening, she asked who he was. "Someone from my old work," Gideon replied. "What kind of work?" Gideon looked out across the dark yard for a long time, and as always, he didn't answer immediately. That night, a fine rain began to fall and lasted until nearly dawn, rain as thin as breath, yet enough to smooth the entire ranch yard into something like a freshly rolled sheet of dough, and it was that smooth surface that revealed what all of Josie's sleepless nights had failed to tell her. Gideon was crossing the yard with a coil of reins in his hands when he stopped in the middle of a step, stood perfectly still for a moment, then lowered himself to the ground, carefully set the coil aside, and remained in that position for so long that Josie, who was hanging laundry on the porch, finally walked over. When he lifted his head and called to her, his voice had changed completely. The familiar steadiness was gone, replaced by something low and taut, like fence wire pulled to its breaking point. "Come here," he said. "Sit down and count for me." Josie knelt beside a clean hoofprint, pressed into the damp earth, the print of a properly shod horse, and ran one finger around the small nail marks impressed along the rim of the shoe. 3 nails on one side, she counted. She counted again to be certain, then moved to the other side. 4. 3 nails on one side and 4 on the other, Gideon said. "No one shoes a horse unevenly like that unless there's a crack in the hoof wall. Drive a nail too close to the crack and it'll split wider, so the farrier has to avoid the weak side entirely and place more nails on the sound side. Keeping a horse walking steadily with a shoe fitted that way takes a master farrier, ma'am. And there aren't enough master farriers in this whole region to fill one hand." Josie asked what that meant, and instead of answering, he rose and walked slowly around the yard, with his eyes fixed on the ground. From time to time he crouched beside another print, and each time he lowered himself, Josie's chest tightened another degree. Those hoof prints, 3 nails on one side and 4 on the other, were everywhere, from the barn door to the water trough, from the trough to the gate, from the gate around toward the line of stalls. They lay over one another, some old, some fresh, like the tracks of someone who had been walking through that yard at leisure for many days. Josie suddenly remembered something. She ran into the kitchen for her telephone, her hands trembling as she searched through the photographs she had taken from the camera screen after the horses disappeared, those useless black images she had studied until she knew every shadow by heart. In the corner of one blurred frame, something she had once dismissed as the shadow of a tree now appeared differently to eyes that had just been taught how to see. A short, heavy horse was moving close to the edge of the yard, its gait pulling slightly to one side, the uneven movement of an animal protecting a weak foot. Gideon studied the photograph, then looked toward the distant woods, where every afternoon for weeks he had been placing small stones beside the depressions along the edge of the property. When he spoke, his voice belonged to a man forced to read a sentence aloud. "The print beyond the forest boundary and the print here in the yard are the same 3 nails on one side, the same 4 on the other, the same uneven step. The horse leading your herd into the woods on moonless nights is grazing right here on this ranch, and its owner is sleeping exactly 20 paces from your kitchen door." The ground beneath Josie seemed to tilt. She sprang to her feet, and her legs began moving on their own, fast and direct, straight toward the barn where Mr. Voss's 2 ranch hands were staying. She didn't know what she intended to do when she reached it. She knew only that something inside her chest was burning. Gideon caught her by the wrist. His grip was gentle, but he held her. "You go in there now," he said, "and you'll prove yourself right. You'll shout in his face. He'll pack his things. And by tonight his employer will know you've seen the truth. Then every trace will be swept away. Every door will close. And you'll be right, but you'll lose the ranch. Being right doesn't pay a debt, ma'am." Josie stood in the middle of the yard, breathing through her mouth, looking toward the barn and then down at the hand holding her wrist. Slowly, one finger at a time, she removed his hand, as though she were pulling herself free from her own anger. The days that followed were the hardest days of that woman's life, harder even than the day she received the news from beneath the bridge. Every morning, she carried the blue enamel pot onto the porch and poured coffee for Voss's 2 ranch hands. The hand holding the pot didn't tremble by so much as a drop when she tipped the spout over Bryce's cup. She even smiled and asked whether he had slept well the night before. He laughed and said he had slept wonderfully, that the air on this ranch was good for a man, and she nodded and said she was glad to hear it. Only after she turned her back and started toward the kitchen did the pot begin to shake in her hand, shaking so hard that its lid rattled. And night after night, in the darkness of her bedroom, the pregnant woman bit down on the corner of her pillow so that the sound of her crying wouldn't pass through the thin wooden wall, wouldn't reach the barn, where the man who had led away her horses slept soundly after a day of being served hot meals by her own hands. Early one morning at the beginning of the week, Gideon announced loudly in the middle of the yard, loudly enough for the men in the barn to hear, that he had to ride into town for more horseshoe nails and machine oil and probably wouldn't be back until late that night. Then he saddled the old gray horse and rode leisurely out through the gate, like a hired hand leaving on an ordinary errand. But once the ranch had disappeared from view, he didn't turn toward town. He circled back upstream along the creek, where there was no road for a vehicle and no bridge, only a steep, grassy bank that a good horse could follow almost without making a sound, because hooves set down on wet grass were quieter than any pair of human boots. He disappeared into the woods from the one direction no one bothered to watch, because no one believed another person would possess enough patience to take that route. Josie waited for him throughout the afternoon, then throughout the evening, while the portion of supper she had saved grew cold on the stove, and it wasn't until well past midnight that she finally heard the slow beat of hooves outside the gate. Man and horse returned in a condition that made her hold her breath. Dried mud was caked all the way up the gray horse's belly. One sleeve of Gideon's shirt had been torn open from the elbow to the wrist. A scratch from a thorn still glistened red across his face, and beneath one arm he held something wrapped tightly inside a raincoat, carefully bound with cord, as though it were either fragile or dangerous. He said nothing in the yard. He led the horse inside, rubbed it dry, gave it water, and only after every need had been attended to did he nod for Josie to follow him into the tack room. He closed the door and turned the hurricane lamp higher. Beneath that circle of warm golden light, he spoke in the low, even voice of a man who had verified every word before allowing himself to say it. "Your woods aren't one solid stretch the way they appear from the outside," he said. "There are 2 separate stands of trees, and between them lies a low corridor of grass, about 2 vehicle widths across, running parallel to the boundary of your land. You can't see it from the pasture, and you certainly can't see it from the main road. Only someone who climbs to the right outcrop upstream and looks down from above would know it exists. That corridor leads straight to the fence at Crown Ridge. There's a wooden gate there," he continued. "The wood has turned gray with mildew, and it looks old enough to have been abandoned for generations. But when I put my hand against it and pushed, it swung open without making a sound, because someone had recently greased those 2 rusted hinges. They were shining beneath the sunlight coming through the leaves, and a few steps from the gate, tucked beneath a tree, there's a wooden trough made from brand new boards that still smell of fresh sawdust. It was filled to the brim with feed mixed with molasses. Sweet feed that no horse in this world could resist." Josie stood silent, and Gideon finished saying what she had already begun to understand. "They didn't need to cut your fence, ma'am. They only needed to feed the horses. During the first week, the horse is wary of the trough. During the second, it becomes familiar with the smell. By the third, it goes looking for it on its own, slips through the grassy corridor, and stands waiting beside the gate. That's why your dog didn't bark. No one ever entered your property. Your horses walked away from their own home on their own 4 legs. Then he bent down, untied the cord, and opened the raincoat. Inside lay a slab of wood as thick as the width of an upturned hand, darkened by years of rain and sun. He said he had pried it from the largest tree beside the hidden gate, and when he turned its face toward the lamp, Josie raised a hand to cover her mouth. The board was crowded with burned iron marks, one laid over another, layer upon layer, like the practice page of someone learning how to write, except what that person had practiced wasn't letters. In the upper corner, the clearest and newest mark was the open-ended horseshoe brand of Cedar Hollow, the iron mark carried by 3 generations of the Lanier family. Directly beside it was the same horseshoe, but with one additional line burned across the opening to join its 2 ends. The open horseshoe had been closed into a circle with a pointed crest, transformed into the exact crown of Crown Ridge. Josie stared at the 2 shapes beside each other and felt the warmth leave her hands and feet. One line of burning iron, one brief stroke. That was all it took for 3 generations of her husband's family legacy to become the property of another man upon the hides of animals she had raised since they were young. Beneath those marks, fainter and much older, was another shape, a slender crescent moon, and beside it the same crescent with another curved line burned into it, closing the shape into a complete circle. Gideon placed his hand over that crescent moon, and the fingers that hadn't trembled while calming an untamable horse now shook visibly. He didn't say a word. He set the board down, opened the door, and stepped into the dark yard. He remained there for a very long time with his back to the lamplight and both hands gripping the fence rail, while Josie didn't dare follow him outside to ask. There was an 8th mark on the board, the faintest of them all, some kind of spiral that had been partly closed before the work was abandoned. When Gideon came back inside, he studied it for a long time, tilting the board beneath the lamp several times, then shook his head and said he didn't recognize which family had used that brand. That night, sitting on a pile of straw in the corner of the tack room, Josie told him something she had never told anyone. She told him about the traveler who had stopped to ask for cool water for his overheated engine on a day when she was still wearing her mourning veil. She told him about the cup of coffee she had poured beneath the oak tree, in obedience to her husband's rule. She told him about the 3 questions the man had asked with a smile. "How many horses do you keep here, ma'am? Is there a man living on the property? Is that dog mean?" And she had answered every one of them. She had even smiled while she answered. Her voice broke more with every word. "I poured coffee for the man who came to count my horses. Gideon." Then she bent forward and wept without sound, her shoulders trembling beneath the light of the hurricane lamp. Gideon didn't touch her. He didn't tell her everything would be all right. He didn't offer a single hollow promise. He only sat there with his hat held in his hands and waited until her shoulders stopped shaking. Then he spoke, slowly and firmly, like a man driving a nail into solid wood. "Your husband's rule wasn't wrong, ma'am. The wrong belongs to the man who drinks another person's coffee to the last drop and then returns at midnight." Before dawn the following morning, while the barn still lay silent, 3 figures moved quietly along the edge of the woods toward the Crown Ridge property line. Gideon went first, Josie walked in the middle, and young Cody followed behind because he had stubbornly begged to come and Gideon had finally nodded his permission. They stopped behind a thicket of low brush, and beyond 5 strands of tightly stretched fence wire lay a pasture as beautiful as a painting, with young grass rising to the horses' knees and animals everywhere, a great many of them, each one sleek and well kept, each bearing the pointed circle brand of Crown Ridge on its left shoulder. Josie searched along the herd in the ash-gray light before sunrise, and then her breath broke. There, less than 10 paces beyond the fence, stood a chestnut mare grazing with her left hind leg angled slightly outward, in a posture that couldn't be mistaken for any other. Juniper, the mare whose mother had died when she was born, the horse Josie had carried all the way into the kitchen on freezing nights, feeding her milk from a bottle and waking for every meal, the horse that had grown up believing she was human and would strike a hoof against the porch step, demanding to be let inside. Gideon pressed a handful of feed into Josie's palm and whispered that a horse didn't distrust someone carrying grain. "Walk slowly," he told her. "Don't call too loudly." Josie slipped between 2 strands of wire, her pregnant belly forcing her to turn sideways with great care, and began taking 1 step at a time across her enemy's pasture, her heart pounding all the way into her throat, her open hand extended before her. Juniper raised her head. Both ears turned straight toward the woman. She stood motionless for 1 long second that seemed to hold an entire lifetime, then came forward without hesitation, crossing the dew-soaked grass and placing her warm, soft muzzle into the center of Josie's palm, breathing out the familiar hot breath and nuzzling her the way she had once pressed against the folds of Josie's dress for milk. The woman stood weeping in the middle of her enemy's pasture, not daring to make a sound, tears running freely while her other hand stroked the white blaze on the animal's forehead. Then she did as Gideon had instructed the night before. She pushed her fingers into the hair on Juniper's left shoulder and brushed upward against the grain. Her fingers stopped. Beneath the smooth coat lay an old scar that had healed long ago, thin and sunken, curving in the shape of an open-ended horseshoe, the Lanier family brand the mare had carried since she was young. Burned over that older scar, higher, rougher, and newer, was a straight line joining the two open ends and closing the horseshoe into a circle. Gideon had slipped through the fence behind her without her noticing. He pressed a small device the size of a cigarette pack against the horse's neck. It gave a single dry beep, and the screen displayed the name and history of an entirely different horse, a different breed, a different age, with Crown Ridge plainly listed as its place of birth. They followed the inside of the fence for some distance while the sky slowly brightened, and Josie counted. She knew this horse's name. She knew the injury that one carried. Altogether, 9 horses she could call by name were grazing peacefully beneath Crown Ridge brands. Cody whispered, his face gone pale. "Miss Josie, can't we go home and tell the whole county?" "Tell them what, boy?" Gideon answered for her. His voice held no mockery, which somehow made the words even heavier. "Tell them she felt a scar beneath the coat of another man's horse. All he has to do is smile and say that a pregnant widow tends to imagine things, and that'll be the end of it. The whole county will nod and pity her one more time." Still, Josie had to knock on the doors every honest citizen had been taught to approach. She went into town, sat before the deputy sheriff's desk, and told the entire story from the beginning. The uniformed man listened, nodded, wrote several lines into his ledger, then read them aloud to her. Missing livestock, suspected of wandering across an adjoining property line. He accompanied the words with a smile that wasn't cruel, a smile filled with pity, and that pity choked her more deeply than cruelty ever could, because cruelty could be argued with, while pity couldn't. She stopped at the forge of the old farrier, Gus Tillman, and when she described the shoe with 3 nails on one side and 4 on the other, his blackened hands stopped above the anvil. He glanced once toward the door before speaking softly. "I fitted that shoe myself. It belongs to Bryce's pack horse over at Crown Ridge, the one with the cracked hoof. But Miss Josie, I still have children and grandchildren in this county. I won't repeat those words in front of anyone. Still, should someone ask me one day at the right time, in the right place, with enough people present, I won't deny them either." On her way home, she turned into the deserted association building, where the registry of every livestock brand in the county rested on a heavy wooden table. She turned through the yellowed pages one by one and found the Lanier family's open horseshoe among the worn pages near the front. Then she kept turning and turning until she found the Crown Ridge crown near the back of the registry, printed on a page that was still white, the ink still sharp. She was bent over that page when a voice as soft as butter sounded directly behind her. "What are you looking for in there, Miss Lanier?" Harlan Voss had appeared without making a sound. He stepped forward and closed the book with both hands, slowly and carefully, the way a man might close a Bible, then smiled kindly. "My family's old brand was a complicated 7-loop spiral. It tended to blur when burned into hide, and buyers were always complaining, so I had it changed to this simple circle, more convenient for everyone involved." Josie looked directly into his eyes and asked the question she had held back for so long. "Mr. Voss, your land is 10 times the size of mine. Why do you still want my property so badly?" And for the first time since she had known him, the mouth that always had a sweet answer waiting fell silent for a single beat. Only one beat before the familiar smile returned. But that one beat was enough for Josie to know that whatever answer came next would be a lie. The price of all those days spent forcing herself to remain strong came without warning one afternoon. Josie was carrying a bucket of water toward the trough when the world suddenly tilted around her. A roaring sound swelled inside her ears. The bucket fell first. She fell after it. She had only enough time to wrap both arms around her belly before dropping to her knees beside the water trough, one hand clutching the wooden rim. She couldn't hear herself calling out, but Gideon heard her. He had been at the far end of the row of stalls, yet within only a few breaths, he was beside her. He didn't ask a single question. He slipped one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, lifted her from the ground as though she weighed far less than she did, placed her in the passenger seat of the pickup, told Cody to watch the ranch, and sent the truck racing through the gate as the sky began to darken. The county hospital was 40 miles away. Josie drifted in and out of consciousness several times during the drive. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw the same things: 2 hands gripping the steering wheel, a jaw clenched hard in profile, and his coat, which at some point he had laid across her body. Neither of them spoke a word for the entire journey. At the hospital, they took her away. Then someone came back and gave him several brief sentences. The baby was trying to come far too early. They had managed to stop it. The mother would have to remain there for 2 days. And absolutely, the nurse said, stressing every word, absolutely no severe emotional distress. Gideon stood in the middle of the white hallway with his hat in his hands and nodded like a schoolboy. That night, inside the stark white room filled with the smell of antiseptic, Josie lay facing the wall and heard the strangest sound she had ever heard in her life: the rustling of newspaper pages, then the sound of that man reading. He sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, his back bent beneath the weak yellow glow of the bedside lamp, holding the county newspaper, the only thing available for purchase at the counter downstairs, and he read aloud. He read the weather forecast: mild sunshine tomorrow, winds from the west, southwest, scattered showers possible toward evening. He read slowly and pronounced every word clearly, using the same deep voice he used when speaking to frightened horses. When he finished the weather, he turned to the agricultural prices. Feed prices had risen slightly. Hay prices remained steady. Breeding stock prices had edged upward. Josie lay still with her eyes closed and her breathing even, pretending to be asleep. She listened as he read page after page of the driest things in the world, and she realized that he wasn't reading for her. He was reading for the baby. Once, he stopped in the middle of a sentence, as though suddenly aware of how strange he must seem, and she heard him murmur so softly that he was almost speaking only to himself, that a baby inside the womb needed to hear a human voice, and what a person read didn't matter. Then he continued. Tears quietly slipped from the corners of Josie's closed eyes, ran across her temples, and soaked into the white pillow. She didn't wipe them away. If she did, he would know she was awake. Sometime deep in the night, after the newspaper had been read through for the second time, his voice gradually slowed and finally stopped. Only the steady beeping of the machines remained in the room. Josie felt his hand come to rest lightly on the edge of the bed near hers, not touching her, only resting close. And at that exact moment, the baby inside her kicked. It was a strong, clear, full kick that lifted the thin blanket into a small ripple. The hand on the edge of the bed jerked away as though it had touched fire. The room went completely silent. Josie held her breath behind her closed eyelids. A long while later, very slowly and very gently, the way someone might reach toward a newborn bird, that hand returned and settled on the edge of the bed, a little closer than before. The baby kicked again, more softly this time, as though offering a greeting, and the hand remained there until morning. Not one word was spoken in that room. Not one word needed to be spoken. The next morning, the night nurse took pity on him and brought him a paper cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway. Gideon accepted it, nodded his thanks, and took one sip. Then he frowned, stared at the paper cup as though it were someone who had just lied to him, and quietly set it on the windowsill without touching it again. Josie watched from the hospital bed, and for the first time in many days, the corner of her mouth lifted into a genuine smile. The coffee at the ranch had completely spoiled that man. After leaving the hospital, Josie sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a notebook, adding the figures again and again until the paper had nearly worn through, yet the final number remained stubbornly unchanged. She was still 10 horses short of what she needed to cover the debt coming due, and the credit fund would grant an extension only if a respected ranch owner in the region agreed to serve as guarantor. Everyone in the county knew there was only one name with enough weight to place on that document. She sold the horse trailer, the last possession she still had that was worth selling, and the buyer drove the price so low that the money she carried home felt no more valuable than a handful of dry leaves. No one in the county dared buy anything costly from her or sell her anything of value. Telephone calls went unanswered. Heads shook quickly before she could finish asking. It was as though Cedar Hollow carried some disease that anyone standing too close might catch. With 3 days remaining before the financial documents for the auction were due, Josie put on the neatest dress she owned, and Gideon drove her into town. All along the red dirt road, the quiet man told her only one thing, repeating it 3 times, each time in different words. Don't sign. Ma'am, don't sign that paper. As long as there's still a breath left, there's still something we can try, but don't sign. The fourth time, she turned and looked directly into his eyes. Then what do you have to give me instead? She asked. Do you have 10 horses? Do you have a guarantor's signature? Do you have any way to keep this land before auction day? Gideon looked at the road ahead, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and said nothing. That silence was his answer, and it was also the most painful thing he could have given her that day. The signing took place in Mr. Pemberton's notary office, conducted with a neat, courteous formality that chilled her to the bone. Harlan Voss sat across the desk in his stiffly starched white shirt and pushed the papers toward her with the smile of a man helping someone close to him. The purchase option stated everything plainly. Mr. Voss would advance the amount she still lacked. If she repaid the full sum before the autumn auction closed, the agreement would lose all legal force. If she failed, Cedar Hollow Ranch would be transferred to Crown Ridge at the price already established. Josie held the pen as though she were holding an iron bar, and she signed, pressing each stroke deeply into the paper, while Gideon stood outside on the porch with his back to the glass door, staring down the street. The advance never passed through her hands for even a second. It went directly into the credit fund's account. Mr. Pemberton stamped the papers, and everyone shook hands as though they had just completed an act of kindness. A few days later, in broad daylight, a strange truck turned boldly onto the ranch road and drove straight across the property line, as though entering abandoned land. Josie stepped in front of it and demanded to know who they were and why they thought they could come onto her property without permission. The driver didn't even shut off the engine. He merely reached toward the seat, picked up a photocopied document folded into quarters, and held it through the window. It was a copy of the purchase option bearing her own signature, and his dirty finger pressed against a line of tiny print tucked beneath the main conditions, a provision allowing the holder of the option to send representatives to inspect the property at any time before the due date. Josie stood in the middle of her own dirt road and read that line, small as a trail of ants, again and again. What she felt wasn't anger. Anger still carried heat. This was cold, beginning at the back of her neck and spreading downward, as she understood that her enemy no longer needed to sneak onto her land. He could enter through the main gate in broad daylight, entirely within the law, through the very gate she had opened for him with her own signature. Then, at the weekend market, with the town crowded around them, Mr. Voss approached Josie while she was buying supplies, tipped his hat in greeting, and said in the kindest voice imaginable that Crown Ridge had entered its season of separating the herds and was desperately short of hands. He hoped she wouldn't mind if he took Bryce and Earl back for a little while. After all, her ranch already had someone staying there now. Everyone nearby heard him and nodded approvingly, praising the powerful ranch owner for being so considerate. Only Josie, standing with her shopping bag in her hand, heard the sound of a bolt being drawn from the door of her home just before the moonless nights ahead. On the drive back, she kept her eyes fixed on the road and spoke in a voice that broke a little more with every word. He pulled those men out because he wants them to come tonight. Yes, Gideon answered. You'll stay awake. Yes, you'll wake me. The man was silent for a long moment, longer than any silence he had given her before. Then he said, I'll wake you. It was the only lie Gideon told in this entire story, and before long, both of them would pay the price for it. That night there was no moon, exactly the kind of night men who worked in darkness waited for. Josie went to bed at dusk, as he had instructed, fully dressed, with her boots placed beside the bed, while Gideon never entered the tack room at all. He took a tarpaulin and a pair of binoculars fitted with night vision lenses, then walked down to the foot of the low grassy hill where the hidden corridor pressed close against the property line. He had already tied the old gray horse inside a thicket some distance away, fully saddled and ready. He sat down with his back against a large mound of earth, lit no fire, smoked no tobacco, and didn't move, dissolving into the darkness like a breathing stone. He waited. Then it came, exactly as he had known it would. First, there was the faint, almost sweet groan of a carefully oiled hinge, so slight that only the ears of someone waiting for it would have caught the sound, carrying from the direction of the wooden gate in the woods. Then came the sound that tightened the chest of the man sitting at the foot of the hill, the sound of an entire herd rising in the darkness, of large bodies shuddering grass from their hides, of joints stretching, then hooves pressing into the soft earth in a calm, steady rhythm without the slightest trace of panic. A whole line of horses began moving toward the woods as peacefully as though they were going to breakfast. They passed within only about 30 paces of where he sat. 30 paces. All he had to do was leap to his feet and shout once, and the entire herd would scatter and turn back. Not one horse would be lost that night, but what would happen after that? The men beyond the gate would vanish. They would change the place, the hour, the method. The net that had been spread for 20 years would slip through his hands again, just as it had once slipped through the hands of another man he had known very well, and everything would begin again in another valley. Across the backs of another woman's animals, Gideon closed his eyes. The horses moved past at the height of his shoulder, the warmth of their large bodies spilling into the darkness, the smells of grass and horse sweat blending with the mist. At the front was the mare leading the whole herd, raising her muzzle and nudging the shoulders of the horses behind her, urging them forward with the sharp, bossy manner she had learned during years of being spoiled inside a kitchen by a woman who loved her. It was Juniper. The man leaning against the mound raised one hand to his mouth and bit down hard on his own knuckle, so that not a single sound could escape his throat. Only when the last tail disappeared into the mouth of the woods did he rise, lead the gray horse out of the thicket, climb into the saddle, and follow through the darkness, keeping his distance, and riding along the outer slope beside the hidden corridor. The trail led him to a hollow concealed inside the Crown Ridge woods, where the headlights of 2 trucks crossed over a pen built from rough timber. A makeshift coal furnace glowed red in the center, and around that circle of light he recognized Bryce with his constant smile, silent old Earl, and a heavy man in tall boots, whom the other 2 addressed with nervous respect as Mr. Alford. Gideon lay flat on a ridge some distance away, pressed the night vision lens to his eye, and took photographs, one frame at a time. The furnace, the pen, the faces, the Cedar Hollow horses crowded into one corner. He captured everything, and he knew that none of it was enough. The land beneath that holding pen was leased under Alfred's name and carried no connection to Voss. The branding iron in the photograph appeared only as a blurred streak of light whose shape couldn't be identified. Anyone could claim it belonged to another ranch legally rebranding horses it had purchased. And the county deputy still ate breakfast at Voss's house every Saturday. His photographs could win in only one place, before 300 pairs of eyes from across the county, laid beside the hands of the very people who had lost their horses. He returned to the ranch as the first gray streaks of dawn appeared, and from a distance he saw a figure standing motionless in the yard. Josie stood there barefoot on the cold earth, her hair loose, the dead flashlight hanging from one hand while the other rested over her belly. She had gone to the stalls. She had counted. 4 stalls were empty, and all 4 had belonged to horses she had sworn she would never sell for as long as she lived. Juniper was among them. The 2 of them looked at each other across the dim yard, and he knew that she knew. "Where were you all night?" she asked, her voice flat and utterly without a tremor, and that flatness was more frightening than any scream. "At the foot of the grassy hill," he answered. "They came through that way?" "Yes." "She passed right in front of you?" "Yes." "And you simply sat there counting my horses as they walked out through my gate, as though you were counting loose change?" She stepped forward and struck both hands against his chest, once, then twice, the blows of a woman who had nothing left in her. He didn't block them. He didn't step back. He stood like a post, taking the full force of a storm. "I stood in the middle of this town and begged for someone to stay with me so I could be safe," she said, each word falling like a stone. "I didn't ask for someone who would use me as bait. I didn't ask for someone who would lie still and listen while everything I own walked out through my gate to serve some private hunt of his." She stepped back and straightened her spine. "Drive your truck off my land." Gideon watched her for a long time, then nodded without offering a single explanation. He went to saddle the horse, loaded his bag into the truck bed, and led the gray horse up behind it. Before starting the engine, he lowered the window, looked toward where she stood on the porch steps, and said only one thing: "Don't sign anything else." Then the pickup rolled through the gate, red dust rising behind it, and taking a very long time to settle. The following morning, out of a habit that hadn't yet learned how to die, Josie still made coffee and placed a cup on the sill outside the tack room. By evening, the cup remained exactly where she had left it, untouched and completely cold. Less than 2 days later, the town already had a story prepared to tell, and Josie heard it in the middle of Miss Pearl's diner from the same thin-mustached man who had mocked her before. He said Miss Lanier had brought the son of Frank Shaw, the horse switcher, into her home, and that kind of blood made horses disappear wherever it went. "Just count them," he said. More horses had vanished since that man arrived at her ranch than during the entire year before. People nodded thoughtfully. People clicked their tongues. Miss Pearl stood behind the counter and asked plainly who had told them the name Frank Shaw, and the thin, mustached man answered without hesitation that it had been Mr. Voss, of course. Mr. Voss still cared about Miss Lanier, he said, and had only spoken up so people could warn her. Josie didn't argue with anyone in the diner. She asked Miss Pearl only one question: who in this county had lived long enough to know what kind of man Frank Shaw truly was? The diner owner wiped her hands on her apron and pointed toward the end of the street, where a small house rested beneath the branches of an ancient magnolia tree. Cyrus Bell sat in a wooden chair beneath its shade, his age-spotted hands still moving quickly as he braided a set of reins no one had ordered. And when Josie spoke the name Frank Shaw, those hands stopped in the middle of their work. Frank Shaw, the old man said, his eyes looking past several decades of falling leaves, was the most honest man who ever held a shoeing hammer in this county. And that custom of wetting a horse's forehead, letting the animal drink its fill, and only then taking a swallow for yourself. There were only 2 men in this whole region who ever did it, your Wade and Frank. Both boys learned it in the same place. In a voice as steady as the sound of the leather moving through his fingers, he told her that horses had begun disappearing from the Shaw Ranch one at a time, exactly as they were disappearing from hers now. Frank followed the trail and did the most honest and foolish thing he had ever done in his life. He went alone to the man's house, knocked on the door, and accused him to his face. Exactly 1 week later, men stormed in and searched Frank's tool cabinet. They pulled out a set of horselip tattoo needles used to alter identification numbers, tools Frank had never bought and had never seen in his life. That was the end of a man's whole life, the old man said. The association erased his name. His longtime customers turned their backs. Father and son left that land together, and Frank worked wherever anyone would hire him until the day he died in a strange place, carrying a ruined name he never had the chance to clear. And that ash-gray horse, he added, lifting his chin toward the far end of the garden, was the last animal left from the old Shaw Ranch. The son traced its papers through 3 different owners and bought it back, then carried it with him the way a man carries a family altar. Josie sat silently on the porch step. The old man lowered the braided reins into his lap and continued with the words that sent coldness across the back of her neck. Miss Lanier, I taught my trade to 3 boys in all. Frank, your Wade, and 1 more, the brightest of the 3. When he was young, he worked as a hired hand at the Shaw Ranch. These 2 hands taught him how to look at a heated iron and know whether the metal was too soft or too hard. I taught him how a brand takes shape when it burns into living hide. That boy now wears stiffly starched white shirts and serves as president of the association. Josie heard her heart striking each beat inside her chest. The unfinished spiral on the board from the woods, she breathed. The old man nodded slowly. That was his family's original spiral brand. He practiced closing his own mark first, practiced until his hand knew every movement, so that when the time came to place blame on another man, he wouldn't make a single mistake. I put the knife into the hand of a boy who held it by the blade, ma'am, and I've sat silently beneath this tree for all these years. Then he pointed toward the rear of the garden. Frank's son has been sleeping beneath my pear tree for the past 2 days, like a dog without a master. Gideon sat up when he saw her approaching, and in that garden beneath the afternoon light, she asked whether he was Frank Shaw's son. He said yes. She asked why he had hidden it. He told her that the day he revealed his real family name would be the day she drove him away, and that was exactly what had happened, except that she had sent him away before he could finish finding what he needed. But Josie didn't stop there. I want the whole truth, she said, not half of it. The man remained silent for a very long time before stripping away the second layer of disguise. He told her about the city 400 miles away, about how the penniless boy he had once been had climbed 1 rung at a time through a world without sunlight, about freight yards, ledgers, and men who lowered their voices at the mere sound of his name. And he said plainly, without asking for even the smallest measure of sympathy, that at first I came back to this region because I had caught the trail of the man who destroyed my father. I intended to use your ranch as a foothold. I intended to use the disappearance of your horses to build my case. And at the beginning, ma'am, I intended to use you as well. Then he took out his telephone and placed it on the wooden table between them. Your debt would take me 1 telephone call before breakfast. Give me your permission, and by tomorrow morning it'll be gone. Josie looked at the telephone, then at the man, and shook her head. First, if your money enters my ranch, that's exactly the move Mr. Voss is waiting for. All he needs is one investigation into where the money came from, and he can take my land outright through the law itself. Second, she said, drawing a breath, men have spent my whole life deciding my price, making my choices, and rescuing me on their terms. I don't need another man to purchase my life back for me. I want to win under my own name. I only need you to stand beside me and look into my eyes when I speak. He raised his head and looked directly into her eyes. Then ask me, he said. Do you have a plan? Yes. Then come back. As the two of them reached the gate, Cyrus called them back and pressed an old tin box with a dented corner into Gideon's hands. Your father left this with me before he departed the county, the old man said. I've been waiting all this time for someone to return it to. Inside was only a yellowed photograph of a very young man holding a small child in front of a ranch gate that still stood whole, both of them smiling. On the back, written in faded ink, was a single handwritten line. Don't let him grow up on hatred. That night, the pickup remained parked outside the Cedar Hollow gate for a very long time with its lights still burning. The man behind the wheel sat motionless with the photograph resting against the steering wheel, and he stayed there until the dew had turned every window white. Gideon returned to the ranch that very night. The gray horse went back into its old stall, and the cup of coffee on the tack room windowsill was warm again the following morning. But somewhere beyond their sight, other wheels had begun to turn. Harlan Voss wasn't the kind of man who sat quietly beneath a suspicious gaze. He had discreetly hired people to trace the past of the gray-eyed ranch hand at the Lanier place. And whatever those men uncovered must have cost him several nights of sleep, because it was far larger than anything he had imagined. But Voss didn't take it to the sheriff's office, and he didn't spread it through town. The old fox chose a far more poisonous move. He sent a brief message northward, directly into the ears of men already itching to overthrow a throne that had stood empty for too long, telling them that their boss had grown soft over a pregnant woman in rural Kentucky. His enemies would kill one another, the land would fall into his hands, and all he had to do was sit back and wait. A hard wind rose that night, the kind that made the sheets of metal on the barn roof shriek at intervals, and beneath the cover of that wind, two unfamiliar vehicles crawled all the way into the center of the ranch yard without asking permission, their headlights blazing at full strength and sweeping across the ground like two blades made of light. Gideon had heard their engines while they were still on the main road. He tapped lightly on the kitchen door and gave Josie exactly 3 instructions. Go inside, lock the door, and no matter what happens, don't come out. Josie obeyed, but she didn't go to bed. She stood behind the kitchen doorway, with Wade's old hunting rifle clutched in both hands, the barrel pointed toward the floor, her finger resting outside the trigger guard, and her hands trembling so badly that the wooden stock made a faint rattling sound. The rifle wasn't aimed at anyone that night, and wouldn't fire a single shot. It was only something a mother could hold on to. Through a narrow opening in the curtain, she watched a scene she would remember for the rest of her life. 4 men stepped out of the 2 vehicles, broad-shouldered and wrapped in heavy coats, forming a line inside the glare of the headlights, while Gideon walked out to meet them with both empty hands hanging at his sides, his work shirt still dusty with grass, his steps slow and even, as though he were going to receive a delivery that had arrived late. He stopped in the center of the light, and the wind carried fragments of words toward the kitchen door. He called each man by name without waiting for anyone to introduce himself, speaking every full name correctly, like a teacher taking attendance among former students. After each name, he added one brief detail, only 1 sentence for each man. Josie couldn't hear the whole of any of them, but she saw the effect immediately on every face. The tallest man, who had been standing with his arms folded, let them fall to his sides. The one beside the vehicle turned his face away. The third stepped half a pace behind the others. Debts from life, she would understand later. Every person in that world carried one, and the man standing in the middle of her yard remembered each debt precisely. Then he lowered his voice and spoke one final sentence, short and quiet. The wind carried only pieces of it, enough for her to understand that they still had time to go back and tell everyone he remained exactly who he had always been. But should they choose to stay through the night, by morning no one would remember that any of them had ever existed. Not one punch was thrown in the ranch yard that night. The 4 men quietly returned to their vehicles. Both cars backed carefully toward the gate, as though afraid of leaving scratches across the ground, and the sound of their engines faded until it disappeared into the wind. Gideon remained in the dark yard for a while longer, his shoulders lowered, then turned toward the house and saw that Josie had already opened the kitchen door and was standing there, the rifle resting against the wall behind her. "Now you've seen me," he said, his voice weary as a man who had just finished plowing an entire field. Josie looked at him from the doorstep. "I saw a man stand unarmed in my yard," she said, "so that world couldn't reach the steps of my home. That's what I saw." The next day, Miss Pearl closed the diner early and called the two of them over. From the bottom of a wooden cabinet in the back room, she pulled out a dust-covered tin box she said she had kept for decades, because she couldn't bring herself to throw away the papers of her late husband, who had once served as secretary of the association. Inside was a thin cloth-bound book, printed back when Harlan Voss's father still held the auction hammer, and Gideon turned the pages with the tips of his fingers until he stopped and read aloud, slowly. The rule stated that any member had the right to demand verification of the identity and ranch brand of any horse offered for sale, before the hammer fell and in the presence of the entire membership. He closed the book. "His own father wrote this rule," Gideon said. "If he refuses, he'll have to reject his father's legacy in front of the whole county." Late that same afternoon, following several crooked lines of writing Cyrus had sent over with Cody, the two of them rode to the farthest corner behind the ranch, where a rotting wooden gate stood buried inside blackberry thickets. A gate Josie had never once opened during all her years as a Lanier wife. They cut away the vines and pushed against the crumbling boards, and before them appeared an old road following the riverbank. Grass covered its surface, but the packed earth beneath was firm and wide enough for a large freight truck. It sloped gently downward and led straight to the highway on the far side of the hill, bypassing the town, every way station, and every camera along the entire route. Josie stood silently, watching the road disappear into the evening shadows, and heard Gideon say what she had just understood for herself. "He doesn't need your ranch, ma'am. He needs your back road." On the way home, they stopped at the house of Hollis Mayfield, the same man who had lowered his eyes beneath the brim of his hat on the diner porch. When Josie finished telling him everything, the old man sank onto the front step and covered his face with both broad hands, his shoulders trembling. "I have to tell you something, Miss Josie. Several seasons ago, I stood beside that fence and felt it beneath the coat of one of my own horses. I felt it clearly with this very hand. Then I went home, and I said nothing, because both my boys earned their meals over there." He lifted his head, his eyes red. "I can't promise you anything grand, but when the day comes and you need me, call my name. I'll crawl through that fence and place this hand on a horse's hide before the whole county." The Larkspur County Autumn Auction was the day when the entire region poured into the open grounds behind the association building. High-sided livestock trucks filled both sides of the entrance road. Buyers from 3 neighboring states walked about with leather cases tucked beneath their arms and pens clipped into their shirt pockets. The loudspeaker crackled as it announced lot numbers. Children and adults crowded around rows of baked goods stalls, and at the center of it all stood the great wooden ring, where each group of horses was driven beneath the auctioneer's wooden hammer. Josie arrived early, with Gideon walking beside her and Cody following behind. Inside the canvas bag over her shoulder were the cloth-bound rulebook, the blackened wooden board wrapped in a raincoat, and the blue enamel coffee pot, which she had brought for no reason other than needing to have something of Wade's close to her. Cedar Hollow's lot of 30 horses entered the ring midway through the morning. A representative from the credit fund placed the bid. No one challenged it. The wooden hammer came down, and the entire sum was deducted directly from the bank debt, as neat as an equation someone had prepared long ago. But everyone there understood that the equation still had another side. Harlan Voss's advance remained suspended above the woman's head, and unless she repaid it in full before the market closed that afternoon, the Cedar Hollow gate would pass into another man's name, according to every word she had signed. Then the loudspeaker announced the largest lot of the day. 120 Crown Ridge horses filed into the ring, each one sleek and polished, each bearing the same pointed circle brand on its left shoulder. The entire auction yard murmured in admiration, just as it did every season. Buyers from 3 states leaned forward. The wooden hammer rose. The bidding began to climb. At that exact moment, Josie climbed onto the ring rail, gripped a post with one hand, cupped the other around her mouth, and shouted across the roaring grounds, "Don't bring down that hammer." The entire auction yard turned at once, like a great animal whose reins had suddenly been pulled. The auctioneer froze with the hammer suspended above his head. Josie climbed down, walked directly through the crowd as it parted on both sides, stepped onto the wooden platform, and raised the cloth-bound book high above her head. "I am a member of this association," she said. "My husband's family brand has been recorded in its ledger for 3 generations, and I am invoking my right." She opened the marked page and read aloud, slowly and clearly. Every word of the rule allowing any member to demand verification of the identity and ranch brand of any horse offered for sale before the hammer fell and in the presence of the full membership. Then she lowered the book, looked directly at the man in the white shirt standing beside the official's table, and drove in the final blade. "The man who wrote this rule was your father, Mr. Voss." A murmur passed through the crowd like wind running across a cornfield. Harlan Voss looked at the book, then at the 300 people watching him, and laughed with the patient amusement of an adult listening to a child recite a lesson. He spread both hands wide. "My house is made of glass, friends. Please, inspect whatever you wish." Josie opened the latch alone and stepped into the center of the ring. Pregnant and small among 120 towering horses, she raised her voice to the entire yard. "I need hands," she said. "Not hands willing to believe me. Only hands willing to brush the hair backward on their left shoulders. Anyone who knows horses will understand what they touch." No one moved. The silence stretched on, long as an entire lifetime, broken only by the breathing of horses and the flag snapping above the tent. Then Hollis Mayfield stepped from the line of people on the left. He removed his hat, placed it on the fence rail, and bent his old back to climb through the barrier. His injured knee forced him to hold the post for several moments before he could continue. He walked to the nearest horse, placed his broad hand upon its shoulder, and pushed the hair upward against the grain. He went completely still. He stood that way so long that his wife began to cry outside the ring before he managed to speak. Then he turned, raised his hand, and 3 words exploded across the grounds. "There is one here." The crowd erupted. People began climbing through the fence from every direction. Gus Tillman, the farrier, carried a flashlight and held it close to each sunken scar beneath the hair. 2 buyers from other states pulled out chip readers, pressed them against the horses' necks, and shook their heads at the conflicting records appearing on the screens. Voices called across the ring. "Whose brand is this? That letter V belongs to my ranch. Dear God, come over here and look at this." And in the middle of that rising wave, Harlan Voss walked calmly onto the platform, raised both hands, waited for the noise to weaken, then let his voice, smooth as velvet, settle over the entire yard. "Friends, I buy horses all year long. I buy from large ranches and small ranches. I have purchased horses from some of the very people standing inside that ring. When a horse is bought, its brand is registered again, and its chip information is changed to reflect the new owner. That has been livestock law since the beginning of time. Anyone here who has never registered a legally purchased horse under a new brand may cast the first stone at me." The entire yard hesitated. Several hands resting on horses slowly withdrew. One buyer from out of state nodded as though the explanation made sense. Someone murmured that registering a legally purchased horse under a new owner was common enough. Josie stood in the middle of the ring among the animals, bearing the crown brand, listening as the whispers around her began to change direction, and felt the ground beneath her sway, as though she were standing upon water. While the ground still seemed to sway beneath her, Josie felt a hand settle gently on her shoulder. Gideon had slipped through the crowd and entered the ring without her noticing, and he bent close to her ear and spoke softly, each word as firm as a nail driven into wood. "They can argue with papers. They can argue with scars. But no one in this world can argue with what an animal carries in its heart, ma'am. Call them." Josie looked at him for 1 second, and then she understood. She walked through the herd, climbed onto the long wooden trough that ran along the base of the fence, and stood upright upon it, with one hand supporting the underside of her belly. When the entire auction yard saw that woman standing above the sea of people, the noise faded on its own. The silence grew so complete that they could hear the radio crackling at the distant baked goods stall and the flag snapping against the roof of the tent. She raised 2 fingers to her lips, 2 short notes, 1 long. The sound stretched across the vast yard like a thin thread, and nothing happened. Not one ear moved. All 120 horses continued grazing or standing without interest, and Josie's heart seemed to drop freely inside her chest. She heard someone behind her click his tongue. She saw the corner of Harlan Voss's mouth beginning to rise. She closed her eyes for 1 beat, thought of all those afternoons in her own pasture, then pursed her lips and whistled a second time. 2 short notes. One long. This time it was longer, more tender, like a plea for them to come home. At the farthest corner of the ring, one head shot up, then another. Then a pair of ears lifted, followed by a sharp breath through flared nostrils, and the entire herd began to move. The horses parted like water opening down the middle. More than 40 animals threaded between those that remained still, pressing shoulders and bumping hips as they came forward with the clumsy, hurried steps of creatures returning to the meal of their childhood. They gathered into a single mass beneath the pregnant woman standing on the wooden trough, their necks reaching upward and their nostrils fluttering. At the front of them all, lifting her muzzle and shoving the slower horses aside with that unmistakable bossy manner, came Juniper. She pushed her way to the foot of the trough, raised her head, and pressed her white forehead into Josie's trembling palm. The auction yard exploded. There were shouts, applause, answering whistles, and the sound of women crying. The noise rose like a stadium crowd rather than a livestock market. And on top of the wooden trough, Josie sank to her knees, wrapped both arms around the mare's long neck, and wept before 300 people without trying to hide a single tear. But Harlan Voss wasn't broken yet. He snatched up the hand-held loudspeaker and shouted that it was a circus, nothing more than a cheap trick, that horses smelled grain and would run to anyone who whistled. Before he could finish, Miss Pearl climbed onto a wooden crate beside the baked goods stall, still holding her ladle, and shouted across the grounds, "Then call them yourself." 300 people seized those words as though they had caught fire. The chant spread in a pounding rhythm throughout the yard. "Whistle, Voss. Call them, Voss. Call them." 300 pairs of eyes left the man nowhere to retreat. Voss set down the loudspeaker, raised 2 fingers to his lips, and whistled. It was a shrill, harsh sound that cut through the air like a razor. Not one horse moved. A young horse standing nearby even startled and stepped backward, pushing its head into the flank of the animal beside it. And in that naked moment, while the failed whistle still hung over the yard, a long, hoarse neigh rose from the parking area beyond the fence and tore the silence apart. Every face turned. The old ash-gray horse in the bed of Gideon's pickup stood with its head held high, pulling the lead rope tight and striking its hooves against the truck bed again and again. The crowd fell silent, unable to understand, until old Cyrus Bell pushed himself upright with his cane, his face white as paper, and spoke aloud what he had just realized, forcing out each word. "Look over there, all of you. That old horse is the last living animal from the Shaw Ranch. It is the only creature in this entire yard that recognizes that whistle, because the man who just made it worked at the Shaw place when he was young. I taught him the trade with my own hands. The only animal that still answers Harlan Voss's call is also the last living witness to what he did to the Shaw family." 300 faces turned from the old horse to the man in the white shirt. In the heavy silence, a dry sound struck the ground. A livestock sorting stick had fallen from someone's hand. Wesley Voss stepped beyond the barrier, his face drained of color, both hands trembling violently. "Dad," he said, and his voice broke in two across the yard. "Stop, Dad. Please, just stop. The entire set of altered branding irons is hidden in the grain shed at the old Tanner Ranch, beneath a blue tarp. I was the one who held the lantern while they worked when I was 19. I know everything. I can't sleep, Dad. I haven't been able to sleep for all these years." Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, something he confessed he had hidden beneath the seat of his truck for weeks. Every morning he had intended to drive to the sheriff's office, and every morning he had turned the truck around. With shaking fingers, he opened it to the final page and read the cold, abbreviated entry written there, recording a payment and the words confirming that the Millers Creek bridge matter had been handled. The name fell into the auction yard like a stone dropped into a well. Wade Lanier's death had never been an accident. No one dared to breathe. 300 people stood motionless like a cornfield before a storm, waiting for the woman on the wooden trough to scream, collapse, or throw herself at the man standing on the platform. But Josie didn't scream. Very slowly, she stood upright on the trough, one hand still resting against Juniper's neck, and the other placed over the round curve of her belly. Then she spoke, not loudly, but the yard was so quiet that all 300 people heard every word. "You heard that, didn't you, little one? Your father didn't leave us. Your father was taken from us." While the entire auction yard was still struggling to breathe again after the words spoken by the woman on the wooden trough, a tall figure pushed through the crowd and stepped onto the official's platform, and the people recognized the Lanier ranch hand, the man the whole county had whispered was the son of a horse switcher. Gideon didn't take the loudspeaker and didn't raise his voice. He simply unwrapped the raincoat, placed the dark wooden board neatly across the open brand registry on the table, and addressed the entire yard in the deep voice that made people quiet themselves in order to hear. "My name is Gideon Shaw, son of Frank Shaw." A murmur passed through the 300 people like fire licking across a dry pasture. That name, the name that had been used as something filthy in this land for so many years, was now being spoken in broad daylight by the man who rightfully carried it. My father closed his eyes on foreign soil with the name horse switcher hanging around his neck. Gideon continued slowly, though he never took so much as a single strand of tail hair from another person in all his life. He paused and let his gaze travel across the yard. "I didn't come back here to demand anyone's blood. I came back to place this board on the table, beneath the light, before the eyes of every person here." He turned the face of the board toward the crowd, and people began pressing onto the platform. Ranch owners, young and old, placed their fingers close to each of the countless burned iron marks covering the wood, and cries rose one after another. "Dear God, that letter V belongs to my ranch. That crescent shape belonged to old Mr. Custis. The anchor brand from the ranch beyond the bridge is here too." They counted 7 different ranch marks on the board. 7 marks, and beside each one was the same brand, with an additional stroke burned into it, transforming it into a closed circle. Even the faint, unfinished spiral in the corner was there, and Cyrus climbed all the way onto the platform with the help of his cane, studied it for a while, then spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. And this spiral was the old brand of the Bandera family. No, it was the old Voss family brand from when the elder Mr. Voss was still alive. He practiced closing his own family's brand first. Friends, in the middle of that human tide, Harlan Voss did something that raised goose flesh on everyone who witnessed it. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He picked up the wooden auction hammer resting on the official's table and gently placed it back down in its proper position with a care that was somehow terrifying. Then he reached up, straightened the collar of his stiffly starched white shirt, and said to no one in particular, in the same velvet smooth voice he used every day, that this matter would be settled in a courtroom, not in a market yard. Then he stepped down from the platform and walked alone through 300 people. The crowd opened before him automatically, creating one straight path. No one shouted an insult after him. No one touched him with so much as a finger. 300 pairs of eyes silently watched the back of that white shirt all the way to the parking lot, and the sound of his engine starting and fading into the distance became the quietest sound of that entire day. That night, after the lights at Cedar Hollow had gone dark and Cody had fallen into an exhausted sleep after the long day, Josie woke with a thirst. Through the kitchen window, she saw Gideon standing alone in the dark yard, the blue glow of his telephone screen shining upward across his expressionless face. She put on her coat and stepped outside. He didn't hide it. He turned toward her and spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before, flat, without warmth, like someone reading an invoice. "All you have to do is nod once. Voss, Bryce, Alford. Before this winter arrives, no one in this world will ever find any of them again. No courtroom, no waiting year after year, no trace left behind. That is what I do better than anything else in this world, ma'am." And Josie wavered. She truly wavered. Wade's face came back to her along with the roar of the water beneath the bridge. Her teeth clenched together. Hot tears rose in her eyes. Her fingers dug into the edge of her coat. One nod. Only one nod. And that debt of blood would be erased from the face of the earth. During those few endless seconds, she knew exactly how badly she wanted to nod. Then her hand found its way to the curve of her belly, where the baby slept peacefully, and she released one long breath. "If I nod," she said, her voice still wet with tears but steady now, "my child will grow up on land watered by the same methods Voss used. He stole from me in darkness, so I have to take it back in the light. There's no other way, Gideon." She looked directly into his eyes. "Put the telephone away. That is an order from your partner." The man watched her for a very long time, as though he were standing between 2 different lives. Then his thumb pressed down. The screen went dark, and the yard sank once more into the gentle darkness of a country ranch. That day's auction didn't end at sunset. It ended beneath the glow of hurricane lamps hung along the fence rails, while every horse from the Crown Ridge lot was led between 2 association members standing on either side, one brushing the hair backward and the other reading the chip. And Mr. Pemberton, the notary, was brought out to the grounds to record everything without once having time to lift his head. By the time the counting ended late that night, they had their number. 44 horses carried the original Cedar Hollow brand, along with horses belonging to Hollis Mayfield's family, the widow Custis, several ranches beyond the lower bridge, and even animals marked with the brands of owners who hadn't been present that day. Each one was carefully entered into the record and placed in an association holding pen to wait for its rightful owner. A representative of the credit fund announced on the spot that the fund was suspending all transactions involving the disputed lot. "That has always been our policy," he said, "and it applies to every customer without exception." Right there in the still brightly lit auction yard, Josie sold 10 of the horses she had just recovered, selling them at the listed price for that day to decent buyers who had remained behind. Then she and Gideon raced into town before the notary office had even had time to bolt its door, and placed the full amount of Harlan Voss's advance on the desk before the deadline written into the agreement. Mr. Pemberton counted the stack of money twice, slowly, as though measuring medicine, then signed his name and pressed down the seal. "The purchase option is null and void from this moment forward, Miss Lanier," he said. "But I have to warn you of one thing. This paper may be dead, but everything else is only beginning. There will be an association hearing, an investigation by the commission, then the courts. Those things move very slowly. It may take years." Josie folded the receipt and tucked it inside the front of her dress. "I have years, sir, and everything that followed came in the way real life usually comes. Without thunder or lightning, only one door after another quietly closing around a man." The Equine Industry Commission opened an investigation at the association's request. Regular buyers from 3 states stopped answering calls from Crown Ridge because horse traders might forgive many things, but they never forgave dirty records. The largest ranch in the county began selling its land one parcel at a time. First the distant fields, then the roadside pasture, then the machinery. As for Harlan Voss, even in the final days when people still saw him walking through town, he continued to wear the same perfectly pressed white shirts and tip his hat politely with both hands to everyone he passed. The only difference was that no one invited him to sit in the chairman's seat anywhere anymore, and in that country, for a man like him, that weighed more heavily than any sentence. Bryce caught wind of the summons and fled the county within the week. Earl stayed, told the investigators everything he knew, then quietly took day labor wherever the smaller ranches would hire him. And there was one thing about Bryce that the county never learned. Police in 3 states could knock until their knuckles were raw and find no one willing to open a door. But when someone in Chicago picked up a telephone and made a few inquiries, the man who had been slipping through their fingers was suddenly recognized by chance at a gas station in another state. And the net of the law slowly began tightening around what had happened at Miller's Creek. Wade Lanier's insurance case was reopened. The cold words written years before were struck from the record, and the honor of the man who had died was returned to the living, to the wife who had walked through every whisper with her teeth clenched, and to the child who hadn't yet been born. Many months later, on a clear morning, Wesley Voss walked the entire long road to the gate of Cedar Hollow. He didn't arrive by vehicle. He led a young horse behind him and carried something wrapped in soft cloth against his chest. He stood outside the gate without daring to ring until Josie finally saw him. He opened the cloth. Inside was a set of reins decorated with silver studs darkened by age. Wade's reins, which Bryce had taken as a trophy and hung in the barn. "And this young horse," Wesley said, his eyes lowered toward the toes of his boots, "is one I bred myself and raised with wages I earned through my own labor. Not $1 from my family went into it. I know there are things that can never be repaired, Miss Lanier, but I believe some debts can still be paid through work." Josie took the reins, her fingers moving over each cool silver stud, then pushed the gate wide open. "Come inside and have a cup of coffee first, Wesley." During that same season, inside the association building, Frank Shaw's crescent moon brand was drawn back into the official ledger in the careful hand of old Cyrus Bell, with a small line written beneath it, "The mark of an honest man," closed by another man's hand. And the black wooden board was framed and hung in the entrance hall of the auction house at eye level, where every ranch owner in the county would have to walk past it from that day forward. One morning near the end of the season, Josie went to the tack room and found Gideon packing his belongings into the canvas bag, with the old saddle polished and set neatly beside him, and she understood what the scene meant before he even opened his mouth. "The work here is finished," he said without looking at her. "There are other valleys out there, Whoever learned the trade of closing brands surely hasn't practiced it in only one place. And in Chicago, there is still an empire waiting for me to return and become the man I used to be. Josie didn't block the door or raise her voice. She walked over, sat on a sack of feed propped against the wall, placed both hands on her knees, and told him to stand still and listen until she had finished. Then he could go wherever he pleased. The day I stood in the middle of town and said I needed a man to protect me, she began, her voice slow and clear. That was the greatest lie I ever told. And the strange thing is that I didn't even know I was lying when I said it. Because think about it. I had protection, didn't I? I had 2 strong men sleeping in the barn with flashlights, keeping watch through the night. And those men were the thieves. What I truly needed was never a man to guard my gate. I needed someone willing to kneel down beside me, read the ground with me, and tell me the truth, even when that truth might cost him everything. You have already been that man, Gideon. Don't go back to that city and become a version of Voss who knows how to ride a horse. The man stood silent in the middle of the room, one hand still holding the strap of his bag, and Josie reached into her coat pocket, took out the yellowed photograph she had kept for him since the night he sat motionless in his truck, and placed it in his calloused hand with the handwritten words facing upward. Don't let him grow up on hatred. Your father wrote that for you, not for anyone else. Gideon studied the photograph for a long time, looking at the young man holding a small child and smiling before a ranch gate that still stood whole. Then he raised his eyes. Stay, he asked. In what capacity? As my partner, Josie answered without blinking. Half and half. We divide the herd, divide the debt, and divide every dawn when we have to wake before the rooster. I'm not hiring another ranch hand. I'm asking for someone to stand beside me as an equal. He released the strap of the bag, wiped his palm against the leg of his trousers, with the habitual motion of a working man, then held out his hand. She took it. It was a firm, simple handshake, neither one holding on longer than the other, the handshake of 2 equals. The following morning, 2 cups of steaming coffee stood on the tack room windowsill instead of 1, and for the first time since the man had arrived at the ranch, they sat beside each other on the rim of the old wooden trough in the middle of the yard, drinking their coffee in silence, and watching the horses spread across the early pasture. And neither of them felt that anything needed to be said. The weeks that followed passed in a kind of peace whose flavor Cedar Hollow had forgotten long ago, until one late autumn night, when the wind changed, and Josie called his name from inside the house, earlier than the midwife had predicted, and earlier than the date written on the hospital papers. Gideon understood from the way she called him. He carried her out to the truck as the rain began falling harder, told Cody to watch the ranch, and sent the pickup racing into the dark road. He drove through the rain, and across the very bridge that had taken the child's father, trying to bring that father's child safely into the world, his hands gripping the steering wheel until every knuckle turned white. At the hospital, they took Josie away behind a closed door, and the man who had once made an entire city lower its head sat on a row of plastic chairs in the waiting room, his elbows braced on his knees, twisting his hat around and around in his hands, like a schoolboy waiting for his examination results. He sprang to his feet every time the door opened, then sat down again, until dawn began to brighten the windows, and a nurse came out carrying a tiny bundle of blankets. Mother and child were both safe, she told him. A baby girl. In the room filled with morning light, Josie received the child into her arms and studied that small, red, wrinkled face for a long while. Then she raised her eyes toward the man standing frozen at the foot of the bed. Her name is Frankie, she said. Gideon stopped breathing for a moment. Why that name? He asked, his voice rough. Because she needs the name of an honest man, Josie answered. And because you need to hear that name spoken in this house every day through laughter, not only in troubled dreams. And the man who hadn't shed a single tear throughout this entire story, not when he spoke of his father, not before the blackened board, not while standing inside the circle of headlights, slowly lowered himself onto one knee beside the hospital bed, bowed his head against the edge of the white blanket, and began to shake with silent sobs, while Josie's small hand came to rest upon his hair. Far to the north, during the months that followed, people in that world began whispering about something stranger than anything they had ever seen. A powerful organization was quietly dismantling itself piece by piece without a sound. Its most important ledgers somehow kept being sent to the wrong address and arriving directly on a prosecutor's desk. No one could prove anything. No one was publicly accused or named. People knew only one thing. that the man who had once ruled all of it was now living in the Kentucky countryside, driving fence posts into the ground each day. Many seasons later, on an afternoon when the sunlight shone as golden as honey, beneath the shade of the old oak tree beside the gate of Cedar Hollow Ranch, the wooden trough that had once served as evidence had become a familiar bench where Miss Pearl, Cyrus, and Hollis sat drinking their afternoon coffee, the voices of the three old friends mingling with the sound of the wind moving across the pasture. Out in the sunlit yard, a little girl with chestnut brown hair laughed brightly from Gideon's broad shoulders as father and daughter made their way around the yard collecting chicken eggs, and little Frankie pursed her tiny lips, practicing the pattern of 2 short whistles and 1 long, while every horse in the pasture lifted its head to listen, because to them, that child was the little mistress of their entire kingdom. The old ash-gray horse, whose coat had now faded until it was nearly white, lowered its great head as far as it could so that those tiny hands could stroke the softness of its nose, and it remained that way for a very long time, gentle as a grandfather indulging his beloved grandchild. In the middle of that peaceful afternoon, an old vehicle slowly came to a stop outside the gate. The man who stepped out had hair as white as lime, and his back had bent deeply with age, but his white shirt was still stiffly starched and perfectly pressed, just as it had always been. Harlan Voss tipped his hat and stood outside the iron bars of the gate. In a voice made hoarse by the passing years, he said, "If your kitchen is still warm, I'd be grateful for a swallow." Josie looked at him for a long time. A very long time. Then rose from the porch and went into the kitchen. She lifted the chipped blue enamel coffee pot that still rested in its old place at the corner of the stove, filled the steel lid, and carried it outside, passing it through the bars exactly as she had done for so many weary travelers throughout her life. The old man accepted it with both hands and drank slowly, 1 swallow at a time, until the final drop was gone. Then he returned the lid, gave 1 small nod, and turned back toward his vehicle. No apology was spoken. No forgiveness was granted. There was only the steel lid, rinsed clean and turned upside down to dry in the sunlight on the stone beside the water pump, waiting for the next traveler who might lose his way, because no one was ever denied a cup of hot coffee and a shaded place to rest, and that woman had never stopped believing in that truth for even a single day. Because kindness doesn't have to die for a person to remain safe. Kindness only needs to stand beside the truth, and no one can save another human being by making decisions in their place. To respect someone is to place the truth in their hands and stand beside them while they choose their own road. Now there were always 2 people standing beside the gate of that ranch. Everyone who arrived was offered coffee, and everyone who arrived was looked directly in the eyes. And the woman who had once stood in the middle of town asking only for a single peaceful night of sleep now slept soundly every night. This is where our story comes to an end. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day you can listen to more compelling stories. How did this story make you feel? Which character touched you most? And if you had been Josie, would you have passed that final cup of coffee through the gate? Please share the feelings from the deepest part of your heart in the comments below. We sincerely look forward to reading every word you choose to share. Thank you for staying with us until this final moment. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.